Right, let's just get straight into it. Today in our explainer, we're looking at how history, which, is usually this massive, ever-flowing stream, can sometimes have its entire course altered by just one single life. We're going to move way past that flawless marble monument version of George Washington that we're all so used to seeing. Instead, we're digging into the dynamic, evolving, and frankly very human leader underneath it all. This is a deep dive into the guy who literally designed the framework of a country.
From a modest Virginia land surveyor to the architect of a nation. I mean, think about that for a second. It's an absolutely incredible character arc. We're talking about someone whose entire life was this continuous, grueling test of resolve. It's just fascinating to trace how a 16-year-old kid who spent his days out there walking and measuring the harsh wilderness eventually becomes the founding father of the United States. How exactly does a leap like that even happen?
Section 1. The Making of Washington, the Crucible of Conflict.
So it all really kicks off in his early youth, out there mapping the serene, untouched Virginia landscape. But, as we know, that peace definitely wouldn't last. Just look at the sheer trajectory over these 4 decades. In the 1740s, he's a modest land surveyor. By the 1750s, bam, he's thrust right into the French and Indian War as a commander. Fast forward 2 decades to the 1770s, and he is leading the entire Continental Army. And finally, the 1780s, taking office as the very first U.S. president. Each of these distinct phases totally served as a crucible for the next one. The surveyor learns the terrain, right? Then that terrain tests the commander. The commander goes on to lead the revolution, and the revolutionary builds the presidency. It's like a giant puzzle coming together.
But here's the thing. That early military career, it was anything but a smooth rise to glory. Actually, scratch that, it was often a mess. His time in the French and Indian War, especially that total disaster at Fort Necessity, was marked by some seriously humiliating defeats. He was beaten, he was outmaneuvered, and he was forced to surrender. But early failure was arguably his greatest teacher. Those devastating losses yielded vital strategic lessons. They're exactly what molded him into the brilliant strategist he'd eventually become when the stakes were, infinitely higher.
Section 2. Leading the Revolution, the Commander's Resolve.
When the call for revolution finally sounded, the stakes became absolute. No turning back. Washington stepped forward to lead the Continental Army against, frankly, terrifying odds. And the reality of this war was grim. He wasn't just fighting the British military, he was fighting the elements in human despair. Think about that brutal, freezing winter at Valley Forge. It literally threatened to completely break the spirits of his starving men. Keeping morale alive in those harsh camps was a monumental task, honestly, just as vital to the war effort as any battlefield tactic. And while he's dealing with all that internal struggle, he also had to navigate the incredibly complex diplomacy of integrating crucial assistance from our French allies. But all of those agonizing lessons learned from his early defeats, all of those freezing winters, it all culminated in the climactic victory at Yorktown. With unyielding persistence, and for sure that critical assistance from the French allies, Washington achieved the ultimate victory. This single event didn't just win a war, it secured the very foundation of American independence.
Section 3. Forging a New Government, the Architect.
So the battlefield is left behind, and Washington now has to pivot to the boardroom. The war was won, but the work of actually governing, that had just begun. Unanimously elected as the first president, he faced an entirely new kind of battlefield. We're talking about establishing federal authority essentially out of thin air, trying to unify a fractured, nascent government that's just starting to find its footing. And of course, managing intense, bitter cabinet rivalries between brilliant but deeply polarized men, guys like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. I really want you to think about why this matters to us today. The immense pressure Washington managed in those early days, those fierce cabinet meetings, those decisions on how to project authority, they established the very precedents of the modern executive branch you and I live under right now. He was literally writing the rule book as he went.
So we've talked about the commander, we've talked about the president, but who was the man behind the monument? When we strip away all the public triumphs and that legendary status, we're left to confront the private contradictions of the human being himself.
Section 4. A complex American legacy. Beyond the monument.
To truly understand Washington, we have to look closely at his private life at Mount Vernon and really ground his legacy in the reality of human contradictions. His legacy is defined by deep complexity, specifically his difficult relationship with slavery. On one hand, he harbored a recorded moral opposition to the institution of slavery. Yet at the exact same time, he maintained an ongoing economic reliance upon enslaved people for his own prosperity. It's a stark, undeniable contradiction. He had to navigate this deep conflict between his personal moral misgivings and the economic system he actively participated in and, well, directly benefited from.
So the crucial point is how we synthesize all of this. Because despite these deep personal contradictions and all the complexities of his economic life, his public life was defined by a very specific set of priorities. His steadfast commitment to civic duty and prioritizing national unity above all else remained absolutely unwavering. And his enduring results, securing that foundation of independence and setting the precedents for the American executive branch, have quite literally echoed through the centuries.
1732 to 1799. Those numbers represent the lifespan of a man who navigated a genuinely staggering array of challenges. From the peaceful lands of Virginia to the darkest trials of freezing military camps, and finally to the dawn of a new nation's independence. He stood right there at the center of the whole shebang. Which brings us to a final thought to wrap up our explainer today. What is the true weight of leadership in the pursuit of a more perfect union? When you finally look past the marble monuments, you see the heavy burden of governance, the painful lessons of early failures, the brutal realities of war, and the profound human contradictions behind monumental history. It's a powerful reminder that nations aren't built by flawless statues. They're built by complex, evolving human beings. Thanks for joining me, and I hope this gives you a completely new perspective the next time you hear the name George Washington.
History is a lot like an ever-flowing stream, but every now and then a single life comes along and completely alters its course. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving in to demystify the myth of George Washington. As an objective historical scholar, I want us to step back and look at the real historical realities. We're going to explore the trials, the massive failures, and the extreme pressures that actually forged an ordinary Virginia planter into the architect of a nation. Here is how we are going to break this down. First, the humble beginnings. Then, the crucible of conflict, the commander's resolve, forging a federal identity, a legacy of complexity, and finally, our conclusion. All right, let's jump into Section 1, the humble beginning. From modest origins to Virginia surveyor. You know, Washington wasn't born as this untouchable myth. He was really forged by early, profound loss. By the time he was just 11 years old, his father died, leaving him a pretty modest farm. And then tragedy struck again when his idolized older half-brother, Lawrence, passed away from tuberculosis. Because of these immense losses, Washington actually bypassed the classical education that peers like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson got. Instead, at just 15, he decided to become a land surveyor. Thrust into all this responsibility, he mastered map-making and geographical surveying. This was a highly lucrative profession, but more importantly, it taught him how to truly read the land. And that is a skill that would soon become absolutely critical to his survival. Moving on to Section 2, the crucible of conflict. Early military lessons on the frontier. Let's be honest, his military career did not start with glory. Actually, scratch that. It started with some pretty humiliating blunders. Washington fought alongside the British, and they operated as rigid regulars. They traveled super heavy and fought in these very predictable, fixed formations. On the flip side, the French and Native Americans traveled extremely light and used agile, mobile ambush tactics. At Fort Necessity, Washington was forced into a really humiliating surrender. Later on, marching with General Braddock, the British forces were just totally decimated by these mobile guerrilla tactics. Washington literally had 2 horses shot out from under him while trying to prevent a complete rout. So the crucial point here is this. He learned the absolute futility of defending poor positions against a highly mobile enemy. He learned to endure failure, analyze it, and adapt. Section 3. The Commander's Resolve, Leading the Continental Army. When the call for revolution sounded, he stepped forward to face what was frankly a massive logistical and psychological hurdle. Think about it. How does an army survive a brutal winter when morale, money, and supplies are entirely frozen? Washington's men were constantly on the verge of starvation, mutiny, or just packing up and walking away when their enlistments expired. Washington's steadfast, unyielding presence in the camp was pretty much the only glue holding them together. Furthermore, his wife, Martha Washington, spent half the war right there with him on campaign. Her dedicated support and care for the men proved absolutely vital to their survival and morale during these incredibly dark hours. But we have to acknowledge the cost, and it was incredibly solemn. 2,500. That grim number represents the American soldiers who died of sickness, hunger, and the freezing cold just during the encampment at Valley Forge alone. He was carrying the weight of all those lives squarely on his shoulders, constantly begging a pretty powerless Congress for supplies that rarely, if ever, came.
But out of this total darkness came some brilliant field strategy. Following those massive setbacks, he demonstrated unbelievable resilience through daring, unorthodox bounce-back strategies. Remember those lessons from the frontier? After a devastating loss at Long Island, he executed a stealthy nighttime retreat right under the cover of thick fog, saving his entire army. When morale was literally at rock bottom, he led a stunning Christmas night crossing of the freezing Delaware River to launch a total surprise attack on Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. He used stealth, he used the weather, and he used the terrain to completely shock the British. It was brilliant resilience in the face of near-certain defeat.
Now for Section 4, Forging a Federal Identity, Governing a Fractured Nation. After securing the ultimate victory at Yorktown, Washington returned as the first unanimously elected president. But governing? That brought the immense pressure of unifying a nascent, deeply fractured government. He essentially had to play referee to these towering personalities in his own cabinet. On one hand, you had the Federalists, led by his former aide Alexander Hamilton, who were aggressively pushing for a strong central government, a national bank, and a focus on commerce. On the exact opposite side were the Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, who demanded decentralized state power, an agrarian focus, and were fiercely anti-bank. These cabinet meetings would literally degenerate into shouting matches. To prevent these bitter rivalries from dissolving the Union entirely, Washington acted as the deliberate, stabilizing force. He helped broker a crucial compromise in 1790. Hamilton's economic agenda, specifically the assumption of state debts, would pass, and in exchange, the nation's permanent capital would be moved down south to the Potomac River, which happened to be an area right near Washington's own Mount Vernon estate. It was an absolute masterclass in political pragmatism, brokered over a single private dinner, no less, that kept the fragile nation from splitting apart at the seams. Which brings us to Section 5, a legacy of complexity, economic realities, and moral contradictions. Behind all his monumental political achievements lay some very deep economic pressures at his Mount Vernon estate. Looking closely at the realities of the 18th century, Washington was actually heavily indebted to London agents. This was due to volatile tobacco markets and his taste for English luxury goods. So when the British imposed taxes like the Stamp Act, it wasn't just a political affront. It directly threatened his economic survival. Recognizing this, Washington shrewdly diversified. He totally abandoned the volatile, labor-intensive tobacco crop and pivoted straight to wheat, corn, and a massive commercial fishing operation on the Potomac. He did whatever it took to secure his economic independence from Britain. But this brings us to a solemn, undeniable reality. His economic prosperity, and really the prosperity of his entire region, relied heavily on enslaved labor. As an objective scholar, we have to look at this glaring contradiction. Over time, Washington grew to privately despise the practice. He believed it was economically inefficient, and after the war, he became morally opposed to it. Yet he completely failed to dismantle it during his presidency. He feared that touching the issue would immediately destroy the fragile new Union. Now, in his will, he did arrange for his slaves to be freed, but his life highlights the deep, painful moral compromises made at the very founding of the nation. Finally, Section 6, Conclusion, the weight of building a republic. George Washington's life stands as this incredibly solemn testament to the true weight of leadership. Ultimately, his most enduring precedents weren't just the battles he won. They were the immense power he voluntarily surrendered. After the Revolutionary War, rather than seizing power as a dictator, he absolutely shocked the world by simply resigning his military commission and returning to his farm, much like the Roman general Cincinnatus. And later, as president, despite massive pressure to stay on, he flat out refused to run for a third term. This cemented a peaceful transfer of power that defined the American executive branch forever. He prioritized the Republic's survival completely over his own personal ambition. So I want to leave you with this question to ponder. Is the true architect of a nation the one who never fails, or the one who learns to endure the crucible of their own deepest contradictions? This objective look at Washington reminds us that nations are not built by mythical gods. They are built by remarkably resilient, deeply flawed men who somehow navigate failure, extreme pressure, and profound complexity to forge something entirely new. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.